Welcome back, everyone. I think this is our first meeting in 2026 for the FHIR Work Group. I'll just go through the agenda. Um, I'm chairing today, and Dushu will be taking the minutes. So, in terms of the proposed agenda, we have a notification, really, I think, an update around the minutes of the last call that we did almost a month ago in December. Updates and news. There's a proposal to review the resolution, which I think is a revisit to a certain extent on the resolution for communication request reason. AU Base R6 publication approval is on the agenda today. There is a ticket from the eRequesting project seeking endorsement of AFMM 1. And there's also two new identifier profiles, a discussion around those, and our next meeting agenda. Does anyone want to withdraw things from that, add things, shift things around? All right, hearing nothing. Let's get started. Brett, can you give us an update on the minutes?
Only that I have not completed them, so there is no approval to be done because I have to send them out yet.
Okay.
So, yep, sorry for the delay, but they'll come out hopefully this week.
All right. So we'll move on to the next item. There's a reminder there about the HL7 International ballot in January. Is that you as well, Brett, giving that update?
I think so, just that it's on, and so I think yeah, the ballot period's still open. I think so yeah, there's still some chance to put some issues in against R6 of fire. If there are things that people want voted on, as well as raising issues, yeah, let us know. Ruben and I have a vote for the affiliate, so we can actually vote in that in that
It
ballot.
closes on
So
Monday.
close on Monday, perfect.
Yep.
So yeah, so if you do have any issues that you do raise that you want to be voted on and actually included in the resolution, yeah, please do let us know. And we also have our AU base, our AU ballot going on in March. So that's open for sign-ups now. I think from the list, I think most of you signed up already. But that would be good if you could get onto signing up. We definitely have patient summary running, and we will probably talk about our AU base ballot during this meeting.
Okay. And I think, Andy, since you're on the line, do we have an update about when the next Connectathon is?
Yes, I can give that update. It is kind of dig out my calendar. It is on March the 11th and 12th.
And I think the 10th is symposium
Yeah, there's
day
just
as well. Yeah.
there's just a discussion going on at the moment about providing opportunities on the 10th, Tuesday the 10th, for working group meetings associated with that symposium.
Okay. Are there any other updates that people have and want to provide in this first meeting back?
I have a question. Is symposium now the term that we're going to standardly use for the discussions that we have at the times of connectathons?
No.
No,
The,
it's
sort
just
of
okay.
yeah. I think
It's
they
not a new term we're using. It's just a commonly understood word that's being used to
Yeah,
different.
because
Okay.
what there will be there will be a symposium stream which will basically be presentations for the day. So there'll be a bunch of speakers doing talking about various things. And during that day, I think there is a talk of having some other rooms for work groups to get together in sessions as appropriate, but I'm not sure that's confirmed. But there's definitely um, like once a year, they're trying to run a symposium event, which is a bit more of a faces presenting kind of meeting, a bit more general kind of activity, kind of stuff. Yeah,
Okay. Right. So
cool.
it'll be an annual set of interesting talks or interesting presentations called a symposium.
Exactly.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to item 3 then. Brett, did you want me to click on something? Do you want to share your
Um,
screen?
I
Um,
think
mm.
I think those tickets are probably not. Yeah, they're things we've talked about in the past. So maybe we can maybe click on one and look at the resolution because they all have the same resolution. Um, I hope. Yes, there we go. So, as part of some rewording queries and the discussion that went around it, for the communication request, originally reason code system, and then the newly created communication request category code system. Part of the resolution was that as we published the communication request reason code system in ballot, was to deprecate that communication request reason code system. After discussion with co-chairs and with the IG publishers, we don't think it's necessary to actually deprecate that communication request reason code system as it's never been published in a working standard. And so we would like to come back to this resolution and actually decide that we don't need to publish that artifact any longer. It's never been published in a working standard version. So we really would like to remove it and just leave the communication request category code system as the artifact to use. Um, so the rationale is more that it's unnecessary to keep that.
So
I think that
essentially,
makes sense given
yeah.
that we repurposed that. It's not like it's for a different intent. We
Yeah.
repurposed the intent. So it is actually confusing having them both there, I think. So.
Yeah, and I think in the previous discussion, we're pretty sure we would remove it in the next publication anyway. That was another another version published. So I think it's more that and I think we can kind of set this up as being conventional behavior because we don't need to deprecate things that have never been committed to in a working standard. So the snapshots are what they are, and ballots are there to be changed as well. So I think we can happily just remove it. So I think I'm not sure if this is technically a revisit or if this is more just changing the resolution extent.
Uh, I suspect it technically is a revisit, even if it, even if the
Yeah,
main substance of what we're revisiting isn't at all proposed to be changed. So
no,
all of that is being kept. It's that this resolution actually does say deprecate, and I think the proposal is to revisit to say remove, or I guess replace, as far as I understand it, it's actually replacing this with category. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's the
yeah,
same code system, it's just got a different title because the work that has been done has furthered the understanding that it's actually not about request reasons, but is actually about request categories. It's the same concepts. So That's what I understand. I don't know. Stephen, what are your thoughts with your work group co-chair hat on? Does this need to be a revisit?
Um, Sorry, can you say that again? I'm just being a bit distracted.
For essentially procedurally,
Yep.
um, the ballot resolution said create a new code system and deprecate this one that was in progress. But the suggestion that's being put forward is actually that in progress code system shouldn't still exist. It should actually be removed instead of published as deprecation in its first outing. And so the question is, do we need to treat this as a revisit?
Yeah, I think it'd be better to treat it as a revisit because if we are removing it instead of deprecating it, we do need to know whether or not, what are the impacts on people who are already using it. It'd be probably useful to revisit it from a procedural perspective.
Okay. As far as we understand, I'll double check that. Oh, no, you can, because yeah, I was going to say, Michael, do you want to comment on if there
Uh,
are any expected impacts?
yeah, I just want to actually ask Jamie a question. I think we deprecated in eRequesting our value sets that use this. Jamie, do you know exactly what we've done with that?
I can't recall. I'll have to have a look as well. Sorry,
I
Vincent.
think when I was looking at it yesterday, that we had in eRequesting deprecated our value sets that would have used some of these code systems. Um, so we would also have to do, if we do remove it, then we'd have to remove those.
Can I ask what the reasoning is behind in the first release publishing something as deprecated?
That's a good question. I only saw it yesterday, so
I think that previously there was a mention that people might have started using it without us knowing about it. And so to be really, um, so to provide support for people who might have started using it without us knowing about it, that we'd deprecate it first. Um, I think that
I
might have
think
been
that
part
was
of
a
the thinking.
firework. That was a firework group conversation. That
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
I don't think we've had that conversation in e-requesting. Um, so I just want to check to see if that was what's in the current build.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
I agree with Richard's recollection. I think that was what I recollect, and hence the reason for me to say that from a procedural perspective, let's sort of like check with with stakeholders on the implications of removing it instead of having the value set as and the code system as deprecated.
So just to be clear, the framing of this is that it's never actually been published as a in a release. So it's 100 of the code system would be as deprecated. Um, so it's only ever been an in progress
I'm very
artifact.
happy with the
And out
idea
of
that
ballot,
it's
the
removed.
decision's been made to not use it and to do something else. Um, so
Yeah,
I think it doesn't mean that people haven't started using it.
I just
But
want
it is,
to
I think,
check.
a strange position to publish an artifact in its first release as deprecated.
Yeah, I agree. I just wanted to check. I think that's probably just how we implemented it. I just want to check the decision that we had
Yep.
on that because I don't remember us actually saying let's deprecate it. I think we just said that we would transition, like we would now use this new one to communication request category. That's one of the ones we're talking about.
Hmm.
Added new. Just trying to find the Jira for it. Jamie, if you're quicker at finding it than me. I hear you. 5709. So we've got use communication request category rather than communication request reason code. Remove the must support all customizations on communication and use communication request category using new category codes. Yeah, so we actually didn't say anything about remove it, but I think we could take that to the next PDG and just say let's just remove them. It's being removed in.
Well, do you bind to those? It's-
No,
So,
so we've got some deprecated value sets that aren't being used now. So
I mean,
I agree. I don't think it makes sense to publish release one with deprecated things in it. I don't know if Andy, if you've got any thoughts on it. That being a problem, removing the deprecated ones.
I doubt there's a lot of implementation as yet. So I think publishing deprecation is kind of a bit weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's okay from an eRequesting point of view, though.
okay, so that sounds like everyone is sharing the position that this is worth revisiting. So in that case, who would like to make a motion to revisit?
I'll do that. Brett here.
Okay, thank you, Brett. Who would like to second?
I'm happy to do that. Michael Wilson.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I will now find the electronic poll. God, it's been a while. Okay, I've launched the electronic poll to uh, revisit this decision that you see on screen in front of you. And for those of you who can't vote, please pop it in the chat. I'll just double check that we have everyone who's voted. I don't think we do. Oh, no, we do. So I'll just count that down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll end that poll. That was unanimous. So we have 9 affirmative, 0 negative, 0 abstain. That is including what is in the chat. So in that case, this has been reopened. Brett, did you want to put forward any further discussion on this before we look to form a motion?
No, only that I think we'll just explicitly state the motion is to remove the communication request reason code system from a base entirely. That will be it.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments before the motion is made? Okay. So then, Brett, did you want to make that motion?
Move that. Yeah. I'd like to move that we remove it.
Okay.
I'm happy to second that.
All right. So we have a seconder from Michael Wilson. I'm going to go to the electronic poll. Any other comments or questions while I find that? Okay. I've relaunched the electronic poll for the current motion, which is to change deprecate to remove. All right, I'm just going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll end that poll. The results are, including what's in the chat, 9 affirmative, 0 negative, 0 abstain. The motion carries. We will make that change. Okay. So that, I think, concludes all of All of item 3. There's nothing further there, is there? I'm just looking at the technical review comment here. No, that's just further explanation of why the revisit should be raised. So the next item is AU Base R6 publication approval. Did you want to share your screen, Brett?
Yep, let's do that. Mm. Um, cool. So part of um needing the final approvals to publish AU Base, we have prepared a publication branch ready for that. So this is really our final review of that publication branch, and we have to review the QA report and confirm errors in that report. We will also be going through some warnings and other information in complete details just to cover off all the things we're seeing in the QA report. And then that will, be our major task in terms of approving AU Base. I don't think there's anything else to do, Danielle, is there? Just to confirm everything else
There's
is.
more information to provide to the FHIR Work Group, but I don't, which is to confirm that a check against all the ballot JIRA items
Oh,
has
yes,
been run
has
to
been completed.
confirm that they are all present.
Yep,
Um, so that's been
that's
undertaken.
been done. Yep,
Um, the usual requirements of things like fixing the dependencies is in place, um,
yep,
which will fix this to the Fire Extensions Pack 520, because there hasn't been a new release.
yeah. Talk about that. Yep.
I think that's all we have to do. Confirm that all the change requests have actually been included, run through the QA.html and confirm the dependencies are fixed, the change log is there and up to date. I
Cool.
think that's it. Um, are you
Great.
displaying the baseline that has the communication request reason removed? You
Um,
are.
I am now. Yes, it just
Okay.
built 10 seconds ago. So, yep. So this one, yeah, in anticipation of removing the communication request reason code system, we've prepped a branch for that. Um, and so we've got that content here. Um, it's probably just worth looking at changelog so we can see, our final state for this release. So for a full working standard release, we have noted breaking changes. We've also gone through all of the specific changes that are brought through. Um, we do remove things that are in draft status from working standards. So ethnicity extension is still in draft status, so that's not included in the release. And we've got essentially all the work we've done. So well done, everyone. There's all the changes that have been done since ballot, and that includes our yes. It has been noted that we did remove this this code system from the ballot publication where it was added. So yeah, so we essentially have our final state for this publication, and we have to review our QA report. Um, so we in this version we've actually added suppression messages for all of the reported information. So our actual publication looks pretty clean because we've essentially gone through all of the items, and we'll go through some of the ones that have not been reviewed in the past today. And that should cover off, making sure we understand everything that we're seeing in the QA report. Um, so in the main report, you won't see any thing except the errors. So these we have we'll look at the errors specifically. These are already approved errors, so we have actually looked at this first error before in a previous release. So I'm probably not going to spend too much time, but this is due to PBS code system content not being published. So we know this is true and normal. And I think we've got one new error to discuss. So this is one to approve. We are getting an error coming from tooling. No, this is essentially just a known tooling issue. It's we are pretty certain we're doing the right thing in terms of setting up this. This was actually some to try and we've made some changes to include some content to help us cover off some warnings that are coming through, and this is now triggering a tooling error to be reported. This is known, so it's been discussed from various IG authors. So if there is a reference to the Zulip chat on that, so it's in Graham's backlog to address, but has not yet been fixed. So that's probably the biggest thing for us today to note. But yeah, it's not causing any problem with the content published at all.
Yeah, if anyone's
Yeah,
interested, the
yeah,
reason for that one, Graham has said, is that
yeah,
even though ID Publisher has the logic built in to deal with it, it hasn't actually been defined in the tooling ID yet. So that's why it's saying I can't find this thing because it hasn't been defined yet, but that's coming.
yeah, cool. So it's a bit of a thinking, yeah. So there's been some chats about why this is happening, so it's all known. Um, so I'm going to go down to all of the suppressions because there's a set that we have not looked at in the past. Let me go right to the one here. So we just talked about this error. So these are grouped together and some of these appear on um, multiple artifacts. So you can see like there's 150 times these things appear for this particular one. But yeah, we'll go through conceptually like these are all understood. Um, so I've got a typo, I'll fix that. But um, I might start with the warnings because the warnings are probably more important. So we've already approved these ones in the past. Uh, Yeah, we have covered off. So in previous versions, we've actually covered off all these warnings before, and so that is something that we probably don't need to worry about because we've talked about it. Go, Richard.
I've got a question about warnings around where it says no definition could be found for URL value, blah blah, NS
Yeah,
Electronic Health Net
yeah,
AU for
yeah,
things like HIPPO and
yeah, yeah. We'll cover that one. Yeah, that's this
okay.
set down here.
I'd
Yeah,
like to know something about that one.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. That's good. We'll get to that one. Yeah. So so these are new warnings, and I think that some of these are new tooling features to which cover which are triggered by our content. So we do in our code systems we do have implicit value sets referenced. So implicit value sets are where value sets are defined to contain all of the content of that code system automatically. Some terminology servers automatically produce those value sets when you use them and ask for them. Um, our we don't have any. There's no concrete definition of that actually published anywhere, and Onto server that is actually supplying this doesn't implicitly create these value sets on the fly. So we end up having there's no definition can be found for these things. So these are actually expected. It's not really a fault as such, but it is something that I think they're considering actually adding features to Onto to actually generate these automatically. But it's not really a problem. So we note that all of these value sets that are defined in AE base have these implicit value sets defined. They have a logical content that could be produced, but we don't have a concrete instance. So that's pretty much expected behavior, as there's nothing to find as far as the IG publisher is going looking for them
I'm
when
thinking
it's going. Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
downterm of impact of this. So if
Yep.
I'm building a system which makes use of AU base, and for instance, I want to validate that values coming into my system actually are in, for instance, AU digital health source system. How do I validate that successfully in my own system if I'm working with the AU base stuff and the AU base stuff can't find this stuff? What would I have to do?
I might uh,
There's the other way.
talk
Yeah.
about this issue in another way to
Oh,
provide further context, and then
yeah,
Brett could answer that question.
yeah.
In all our code system FHIR artifacts, we already set as part of our conventions what the URL actually is for the value set, because there's an element code system.value set where you say what the canonical URL would be for that value set, or is if you've published it. What we haven't done are published any value sets. So similar to what you're seeing on the ns.electronichealth.net.au ones, every time IG Publisher sees a canonical URL, it tries to resolve it. And if it can't find an FHIR artifact at the end of that URL, it's putting up a warning. Um, and so that's what is happening here. We've got the canonical URL for the value set, whether it's published or not, set in the code system FHIR artifact. But for these ones, we don't have yet an explicitly defined value set artifact. We've only created the ones where we actually bind to them in profiles.
Mhm.
So with that kind of context of which is, I think, not answering your question, because you're going into use and how do we determine that. But I just wanted to provide more
Yeah.
context for the warning.
Yeah, so I think that and this is I think why we're getting the warning is because there's no concrete definition of it. You actually can't bind to it because it doesn't exist, and the terminology server doesn't support supplying it a definition for it.
Right.
So I think
And
yeah,
likewise, somebody implementing is unlikely to want this particular value set as part of their validation. Um,
they may, but it's left as a problem for them.
yeah,
It's actually a problem for their terminology server.
yeah,
In that it can be automatically implemented.
right. So
And we
to
haven't
do their
concretely
validation,
implemented it yet.
they
Yeah.
need to choose a terminology server that can in fact supply this value set. And
Yeah.
so that would be, and that's the way they deal with the problem. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I know the terminology folks are considering this as well because they know it's a something they can think about in terms of terminology server operation as well. So it may be in the future solved via that path. But I think we have no intent to actually publish these until they're bound to something. Yeah. Cool. Um, any other comments? I'll just move on. Cool. I'll just move on. We go on to now these are URLs for identifier systems or identifier types rather. And the the um, the issue here is that there is no FHIR definition resolvable at that location. So the IG publisher is trying to go and find a FHIR representation of that system, and there's nothing at the end of that. Potentially, it could be supported, but at the moment, none of these resolve to anything some of them resolve to page. I think, in fact, all of these resolve to descriptive pages. Um, but um, but I think the IG publisher is actually looking for um,
I'm pretty sure ID Publisher is looking for a
namespace.
naming system
Namespace,
artifact.
yeah, naming system.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Why?
because everything just has a HTML page, I don't know whether or not this, because that's not to say that these don't have FHIR artifacts that define them. We've got all of these, I'm pretty sure, have actually all have identifier data type profiles. Um,
Yeah.
but that's not, they don't live at the URL. And so ID Publisher resolves the URL, finds a HTML page, no FHIR artifact, and says, look, I can't find a definition.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really like
One of the
it's
way
obviously something they would like us to do, but it's not done. Yeah. Sorry,
a
Jeff.
way this has come up for me just recently is when I was looking at the identifier types. So let's pick the hippo one in the middle there with
Yeah.
12 users. So if I have in AU base an example, which an example of say organization, and it has an identifier in the example which is a which no, I think I've just talked myself into a I've talked myself into a dead end there.
You might be talking about warning 15, the
No, no,
qualified
no,
namespace,
no,
where you've got
no.
like examples where you've like got ABN scoped or so forth, because we're never going to have FHIR definitions
Yeah,
for
yeah, yeah. No, I
what
think
every single organization.
no, I think I've just solved my problem, and I don't think I need to take everybody on the journey because I don't think
Yeah. It,
it won't be. It's not of wide interest. I think I've just solved my
yeah.
problem. Thank you.
Some,
Sorry for
yeah.
the distraction.
I think some other jurisdictions, like I know Canada has a naming system registry where you can register naming systems, and they are represented fully, and that's a place you can look them up
Hmm.
um, as well. So and like then we have had some back channel work of thinking about doing that because we have a whole set of these identifier. Some of them are HSM Australia, and some of them are Agency Interstate Electronic Health. But yeah, there is no formal definition in fire structured naming systems,
But even if
to
we
define them.
do,
Yeah.
even if we
Yeah.
had naming systems, if the
Yeah.
URL doesn't redirect to it, that
Yeah.
warning will still be there because
Cool. Still
it's
happen.
just going to that page. It doesn't mean these things don't have FHIR definitions. It just means it's not at that URL when it resolves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's not really, I mean, for usage, it's not really causing a problem for anyone using AE-base. And yeah, it is just and we do have descriptions and reference these descriptive pages, I think,
I'd
as
like
well,
to provide
as
a little
possible.
more context.
Yeah.
That text, no definition could be found for URL value, blah, 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 is actually a rewriting of a previously accepted warning. It was the ones that
Ah,
said URL does not resolve. Because
mm,
that wasn't clear to the community, they've rewritten the warning. And so it's
yeah.
still the same logic sitting behind an ID publisher and the same sets of warnings. Um, but the text itself of the warning is now clearer for what ID publisher is actually looking for.
Cool. All right.
Yeah, I'm not troubled by this anymore. I was, but that was because I was confused about something else.
Cool. Um, I'm going to go on. So we also have external examples URLs. So these are um, either externally defined references or essentially generated references for use that are arbitrary. So I think a few of these have come from um, uh, like this has come from the provider directory project. This has also come from the provider directory project, um, and I couldn't locate it at NS Electronic Health. So I suspect this may need some review. But it's on an endpoint example where it's not actually relevant to the AU base as such because it's just an example content
Right. So
demonstrating some of the other code systems extensions rather. Sorry.
is that an example of, sorry, is this a warning where we probably do want to do something going forward, but it shouldn't disrupt the publication, as opposed to
Yeah.
some of the other ones where we
Yep.
don't have to worry about them in the future? So this
Yeah.
maybe is a more work required, but later sort of situation. Is that
Yeah,
right?
exactly, Richard. Yeah, I think
So,
so.
for the
And
minutes,
yeah,
should we take an action to investigate that particular warning there? Um, t
yeah, I suspect we could roll it into a reconciliation with the HCA project because it's there's material there that's essentially reflecting things that are going on in that project. Um, so
are you
because it's
happy
really
to
just
investigate that, Brett?
yeah, I think
So,
so. I think it's
looking at
more just a
time,
feature
we
cleaning. Yeah, yeah.
I think we need to take an action to investigate that and move on, noting that none of those example warnings are new. They were published in the last release. That all that content is published in the last release of Base. So they
Yeah,
haven't been introduced in this release.
yes, true. Yeah, these are all previously existing
So for the
examples.
minutes, is
Yeah.
there any other one that you were suggesting, Brett, that should be followed up on besides the
Um,
ns.electronichealth.net.au /SMD/target?
no, that's the only one I think
Okay.
I need, yeah, probably to be followed up on. The rest are kind of external examples. Um,
Okay, so let's move
this is,
on.
yeah, I think so. And yeah, so in a similar vein, but we know that this is a structure that is used a lot, is using the ABN or HPO scoped identifier systems, where you use an ABN or an HPO to define um, an identifier system. So pretty much these, there may be as many of these as there are organizations that are scoping their identifiers. So this is really just a set of examples that we contain showing the use of that methodology. So there's nothing, um, yeah, there's no problem here. Yeah, this is the recommended way to kind of scope identifiers of various types using the NS Electronic Health Agency preferred methodology. Yeah, for organizations. So I think hopefully that all makes sense.
Um, that where it says warning 15 to approve, is that a count of the things below it? Because they add up to
No,
17.
no, that's really just groupings. So yeah,
Oh, it's
it's
warning grouping
maintaining order.
15.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's to keep our groupings in order. Basically, so it's just a number to yeah in the sets of warnings. Um, cool. So I think that's that. We have canonical pinning. We don't. Uh, so as part of the content, we have use of extensions that are sourced from the extensions pack, the FHIR extensions pack. We, as part of the automatic selection of the extensions pack, we're getting the 5.2.0 version of the extensions pack. It is possible to explicitly pin the version in use into the spec. At the moment, we have left this to be the current version. So we're getting a warning saying something about that. Um, at the moment, we are considering that we would not pin these extensions. So the extension pack would go move up in terms of um, what you might use, uh, which does leave um, the kind of handling
Right,
of
I'm going to
any
give a
changes.
5-minute warning for
Yeah,
going through all of this content
yeah,
and then
no
open for
worries,
questions.
no worries. So I guess any concerns about the about that's something we haven't looked at before in the ballot publication. Nope, that's good. I'm going to move on to MIMS and PBS. We have MIMS and PBS code systems defined in AU base. They don't have any content included. And because they don't have any content, whenever there is a code um, uh, that is being tested, that is bound somewhere and being tested, we're getting a warning. So basically, there's that can be even other code system types. So we have like a SNOMED code getting tested, and it says it's not in MIMS, which is the bound terminology, which is true. Um, and so we get these warnings as well for MIMS and PBS. I think this is something too we have seen in the past, but this is another version of that warning. So hopefully that's fine. Um, we also get a variation where there's no binding on an element. So I'm going to follow this one up with Graham as an IG publisher question because it's basically um, when there's an example value set binding on an element, it's actually still doing a validation test, but essentially an empty value set, which doesn't make sense, really. But it's definitely not a problem for us. So this is really just an IG publisher um, uh, kind of warning that I think is probably unnecessary. I'll probably follow up with Graham on that one. Um, and
I
that
think
covers
it's
off
reasonable to
all the
frame the last
warnings.
two as
Yeah,
almost approved already. We know that's the
yeah,
behavior of the structures in AU base. Uh, Additional warnings are added to IG Publisher around this kind of content, which is why we're seeing some new warning messages, but the
yeah,
underlying reason is exactly the same.
yeah. I'm just going to quickly look at the information ones. Like these are not really important, but if I think probably we could just say if you want to take a look through them, there's some things here we kind of know are true. They're mainly covering
I'd like
draft and
to note
experimental content.
information
Yeah.
two, that's already approved. Like the
Cool.
information 02 NCTS experimental value sets, we
Oh,
have
yeah.
explicitly approved understanding there were
That's
messages
good.
from IG Publisher about that in previous
Yeah.
releases.
Yeah, and I think we can just basically group these as like experimental and draft value sets and code systems that are published. And so in fact, this is expected behavior. We've got some things published in FHIR. We've got some common code systems that are published as draft or experimental. We've also got yes, that's the main thing, and we know about this. This is a change request on NCTS on these RCPA value sets as well to move them out of experimental status. Um,
That should be in January release.
Jan, yeah, cool. So yeah, like in theory, that would just go away in a future publication. The only other kind of things are pretty much expected stuff. So we've got deprecations. So we have some things noted, which are essentially extension pack deprecations, and essentially pattern is a structure definition content thing that's not available in the R5 of FHIR, but we will deal with that when we publish in a future version of FHIR. And we've got some inherited warnings. So there's actually some information things coming through from R4 itself that we are picking up. We have an expansion of a value set that's too large to display, which is pretty much normal for things like SNOMED. And that's all the things. So just if there's any comments on that, that's it.
Thanks, Brett. Are
Yeah,
there
we
any
don't really need to
questions or
approve those, but
comments
we've got them.
on those items? All right. Does anybody have any concerns about the list of information and warnings current in this AU-based QA.html? Well, okay. If no one is concerned about any of these particular items or would like any further information before we proceed, then I think we can go ahead and look for a motion to accept uh, that set of information and warnings and errors for this release of AU base. So, who would like to form a motion?
Happy to move. Happy to move. Danielle.
Thank you, Stephen. Who would like to second?
I'll second it, Richard.
Thank you. I'll just go to the electronic poll that I seem to have lost the button for. There it is. Okay. Okay, you should see in front of you the electronic poll to accept that set of errors, information, and warning on AU base. And I'll count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will now end that poll. We have, including in the chat, 10 affirmative, 0 negative, 1 abstain. So the motion carries. We accept those results. Is there anything else, Brett, that you would like to walk through before we go for publication approval?
No, I think that's all we really need to cover, so I'm happy. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll open that up to the people on the call. Is there anything people on the call would like to see prior to moving for publication approval for AU Base 600? Not hearing anything. Brett, did you want a motion for publication approval?
Yes, please. Just yes, motion to approve publication of AU Base R6.
Thank you. Who would like to second?
I'll second Doshi.
Okay, thank you, Dushi. Any comments or questions? Okay, you should see
What
the
do we
poll in front of
do?
you to approve publication of AU Base 600. Just give it, we've not quite got enough people. A few more people need to affirmative, negative, or abstain. All right, I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll with what's in the chat. We have 10 affirmative, 0 negative, 1 abstain. The motion carries. We have approval to publish AU Base 600. And I should share my screen and we can bop on to the next agenda item, which I think is in support of eRequesting. Okay, so we've got the eRequesting profiles. We've got Jamie down as the person speaking to that.
I think I'm
Would you
going
like
to
to
do
share
it,
Oh,
and
you're going to
Jamie
do
will
that?
jump in if I get anything wrong. So,
Did you want to share your screen?
yep.
All right, I'll stop sharing.
I think I'm going to send. Oh, hang on. Try again. Yep. Okay. Hopefully, you can see my screen. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so the last eRequesting TDG of the year, last year, we had this proposal looking to move some of our eRequesting artifacts from draft 0 to AFMM 1. So there was 6 in there. A number of these were our obligation profiles that were just AU core profiles that we put into eRequesting so we could add obligations. And we've got our communication request category value set that we've just been talking about earlier today as well. So we went through the QA report with the TDG and we accepted all the warnings and errors, and there was a successful vote on that. So I'll just go through what we went through with the TDG quickly. So there was these 6 artifacts. that went through. Only one of them didn't have any errors or warnings. That was the communication request value set. So that one was good as is. The others had some warnings on them. I will actually make that a bit bigger. So this is a summary of the warnings that were on those other profiles. Some patient, we had 8, and practitioner 3, and practitioner role 2, but these were all the same, which was tooling generated warnings about the pinning, and we've already accepted that, I think, in the FHIR Work Group. That's their acceptable warnings. And then there was one on the communication request category, which was similar to one we've talked about, which is it couldn't be found. It's a tooling warning again, can't resolve NCTS profiles. And this is something the FHIR Work Group has previously accepted as well. So they were all to be expected ones, nothing out of the ordinary there. Then we had a number of other warnings that just popped in just before the meeting. And these were caused by the addition of another authoritative terminology server. So that was tx.hl7.org.au was added as another authoritative terminology server, and it created these warnings for us. That a definition couldn't be found to the canonical URL there. So this was inherited. They weren't specific to eRequesting. We hadn't actually made any changes to any of these profiles. It was not related to the profiles themselves. It was tooling generated. There was a Zulip chat on this, and we did accept them based on that. Since the meeting, they have actually been resolved anyway. That issue with the additional authoritative server has been sorted. So they have gone away now anyway, but the TDG did accept these on the day. So we had, jump back to it. So yeah, the TDG had accepted those warnings in the QA report and considered that they were substantially complete and ready for further validation and moved to AFMM 1. And we noted here the version of the publisher. So as we know, the new ones pop in over time. So we just added the date and the version that was validated against at the time.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Are there any questions? Okay, hearing none. Would you like to form the motion, Michael?
Yeah, I'd like the motion that the FHIR Work Group accept the move to AFMM 1 for the artifacts listed here, these 6 artifacts listed that the eRequesting TDG has already accepted.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Who would like to second?
Yep, happy to second that.
Thank you, Stephen. Any further comments or questions? Okay, I will relaunch the poll. You should see that in front of you now. The motion is to endorse the AFMM 1 for the artifacts as shown on screen. And I'll count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end the poll. I'll just check the chat, which I wasn't quite up to date with. Okay, so with what's in the chat, we have 11 affirmative, 0 negative, 1 abstain. The motion carries. We are endorsing AFM 1.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Michael. I should start sharing my screen again. Go. Okay, next item on the agenda is, I think, well, obviously now that we've basically finished AU Base R6 today, well, it's onto the new stuff, isn't it? So, Richard, did you want to take us away for going through the 2 proposed identifier profiles?
Yep, sure. I'll share if I can. Hang on. Just a minute. Find this. Drag this. Move this This one. Right. Okay. Hang on.
Okay, we can now see the Happy New Year 2026 backdrop.
Okay. Oh, and that's all you're seeing? Okay. So let's do a stop share. I'm probably trying to does that one work better?
Okay, yep, we can now see data type profile AU HAE.
Okay, right. Oops. Hang on. Oh, good. Yeah, I'm using a large screen, so I'm just sort of wanting to make sure. Is that big enough? Should I enlarge it for people or is it fine?
I could do with one more zoom in.
Okay.
Yep, that's better to
Okay.
me.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm on one of those larger monitors, so it's a bit hard to know what's going to be a good size for people. Okay, so it's the let me think now. There's a couple of identifiers handed out by Services Australia which don't currently have FHIR profiles to describe them. And we think that it would be a good idea to have standard profiles like they exist for HPIO for these two identifier types. They're going to be used as part of the provider directory system. And we originally were working on putting them in as part of the provider directory system and then realized that no, these are AU-based style ones. Here's what we've got currently for HIPPO, which is structurally very, very similar. So we've got this HIPPO one. There's a bit of blurb about what it is and how they're allocated. The way they're basically set up is the profile of identifier. It's got a type, and the type is set to say it's an NOI, which is a fixed value to say it's a national identifier. It's got to have a system and it's got to have a value. The system has a fixed value, which basically says I'm a hippo, and the value has got, we've got an example. Services Australia has provided some reserved example values for hippo, so they can be used to meet the validation. There's some validation rules around it. So it's got to be 16 digits. It's got to have a prefix of this, and it's got to pass the Luna check. So that's the existing stuff that we have for hippos, and hippos have an example. So here's an example in AU base that uses the hippo, and it's got bits and pieces about the organization. If you look at it, the identifier comes up this way. If you look at the gory details, you've got here is the full identifier down about it. And so basically the idea is to do the same thing for two new identifiers. Any questions before I introduce the two new identifiers? Taking that as no questions. Okay. One is an HSP-O, which is for a healthcare support service provider organization. I've just taken the same structure of sentence and put basically the same stuff in it. It's got a little note on it to say that an organization can't have both a HIPPO and an HSP-O. Okay. Similar sorts of stuff here. Two things that show up as different to the other one. One is I don't have an example. At the moment, we don't know of any reserved example values. So that's where we're.
Can I ask if that has a request for that being put into Services Australia?
Yes, we've made requests to Services Australia. We made them either mid-December last year. We hope to get back some answers from them. They know that we're going to have to come back with examples fairly soon. I think I said that if they could get us examples by the end of January, we could live with that. Otherwise, we'd have to find a way of having these move forward without example values.
Is the format, like the real format, known? Even though there isn't yet, I guess, the test arc, I guess, is what we're comparing it to, like for HPIOs.
Right. I mean, so yes, so we have a lot of data on what it looks like. So
Hmm.
here's the we know that it's 16 digits. We know that it's got this as a prefix. We know it's a LUN check. And there's this extra bit in it. And so there's a resource management partition, so which has to be a value from here to here. Okay. So the way I've addressed this part of it was to say, let's follow what we've done in the other ones of having these three parameters, and we'll just introduce these three invariants. We'll introduce an extra invariant which talks about this resource management partition, which is a little bit that fits in the number. Now, so we know exactly what they look like. What we can't do is come up with a value that might not one day be used by a real organization.
Yep.
Okay. So I've created an example that looks like this, but so there's an example. There we go. That's what an example sort of looked like. It's got the 80364 at the start. It's got this other stuff in the middle and so on. So this is what the example would look like. But I haven't actually put it in as an identifier example value because I was hoping to wait until I had one that was a reserved value for that.
Which I agree, you would have to.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be safe to include in AU base something without having the reserved arc known.
Right, yes. So, I mean, the choices are, or we put in one which is invalid, and we don't want to put in one that's invalid. So, this is as far as we can get with this at the moment. Interestingly, because of the way organization is defined, this example, which you think, oh, it's going to fail. No, it doesn't fail validation because it's a perfectly valid identifier. And
Hmm.
there's nothing here there's nothing in AU base to say that a HSP-O has to be a valid HSP-O.
Indeed.
So
Yeah, that's how they all work.
oh yeah, that's how they that was my aha moment a little while ago. So
Although, according to the FHIR standard, what it is doing is saying, I know this organization has a HSPO, I just don't know what it is. Because that's what the
yes,
guidance in the FHIR standard on how to construct an identifier, where you know what there is one, but you
yes,
don't know the value.
yep,
So that's what that's doing, is saying there's an unknown HSPO.
yep. So my hope is eventually we'll have a value to put into this, and then I'll have a conversation about what to do if we don't actually get an example in time, example values.
Hmm.
HAE, basically the same thing. It's got HAEs, a healthcare administration entity. Their identifiers, they have a resource management partition of 1100. Other than that, they're the same. And so that's these two ones. I'll jump through the hoops of doing a JIRA and a branch and a pull request and all that sort of stuff. And waiting on Services Australia telling us that we've got some reserved example values. Any questions? Will I stop there?
I think I have questions and comments.
Yep.
I think this might be more of a comment on the third invariant, or actually it's the fourth, in HA3, for example,
Yep.
which talks about the petition at the end. I think that applies to the other national identifiers.
Oh, yes, we have the possibility of introducing those into the other ones.
So I think the expectation would I don't think we need to manage these more strict than the other ones. So I think we either manage them all the same way. Um, well, actually, we should manage them all the same way. So either we add in the extra bit to the like HPIO.
Yep, that's quite doable. It's quite straightforward. I guess one thing is how would we want to do it? Do we want to do it as two pieces of work? One just doing these two new identifiers and another one adding in the extra validations, or just bundle them all up into a single piece of work, which is updating identifier profiles, which includes extra validations on some of the existing ones and two new ones.
Well, I think each of these identifier profiles should be their own JIRA
Yep.
that gets voted on.
Yep.
It's unlikely, but there's potential reasons
Yeah.
that one might pass immediately and one might need something else. Who knows?
Yep.
And the there could be a third JIRA that changes adds this invariant to the national identifiers it's appropriate for.
Fine.
Because this would
Three
also
JIRA.
even be like IHIs, for example, wouldn't
Oh,
it?
yes. A lot. There's, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 of them that have got useful values that can be put in for these. Yeah.
I would suggest the idea of and proposing to the community that there's a data quality restriction showing that resource management petition gets handled separately as like an in-principle decision on let's apply this to all the national identifiers.
Yep. Okay. Is that something we want to propose at this meeting or hold
We
over to
could.
next
I don't
meeting?
know if we have enough implementers here. I mean, this would impact everyone who's implemented this. I can't see that would necessarily be a problem, but maybe there should be like a Zulip warning first and a
Yep.
question on
Yep.
that.
Yep. I mean, at one level, what we've got is that Services Australia issue the identifier. So you're not supposed to be passing around an identifier which hasn't actually come from Services Australia, who are the people who hand them out.
Of course.
And they claim that when they hand them out, they follow certain rules. We now know another rule. We now are in a position to validate another one of the rules that they claim applies to the identifiers they issue. So the only way that things come up failing them would be if somebody's got what's in effect a damaged identifier string that they're exchanging. And with the Lund check, that's very unlikely. So I think that's the position we're in at the moment of people are very unlikely to have any real world problems with
Well, if
identifiers
the
that they're
Lund check
passing
is
around.
taking care of that,
Yeah,
what's the added value of this extra invariant for
there
the
may be none at
processing
all.
cost?
There may be
Wow.
none at all.
And as soon as you introduce, I mean, I have no idea what a resource management partition is.
I
And
know, do I?
why is it relevant to me? So by having this there, you kind of, it's all very well saying that this portion of the identifier must be 1100. That would be great. You can say that. But I don't think it's helpful to introduce a concept and not explain what it means.
Yep. I mean, I guess that what's happened is that somebody at Services Australia have said, hey, look, we've got a whole bunch of identifiers that we want to hand out in this space. And we want to partition them for some reason. So let's start doing that.
But that sounds like an internal issue, not an external
absolutely.
issue.
Yeah. I mean, so I think something like that's the explanation. But as for, is it useful to tell everybody about it? Is it useful to make it part of AU base? Yeah, I think that's a good question. There may not be any value in having the HAE3 variant and equivalent.
Can I just ask whether there is any documentation on the policy foundations for these new identifiers that, I mean, maybe I've been living under a rock, but where is all of the implications of this explained somewhere?
So what do you mean by the implications? You mean the implications of having a different set of organizations get identifiers where the
Yeah, what are
organizations
we
don't meet
supposed?
the criteria for getting their pre-existing identifiers.
Yeah, and I mean, organizations often have um, multiple roles, and therefore they have different parts of their organization that operate with for different things. So I'm curious about how these new identifiers either potentially constrain an organization or enable an organization. What are the implications for coexistence of them? Um, what are they used for? What's the I've and these are interesting definitions, but um, what is administration? Is it administration of clinical artifacts? Is it administration of organizations? I just don't understand the wording.
Yeah, look, the wording is what's come from Services Australia. So one of the things I can do is try and find their page if they have any public information that explains the details of these, and then put links to that into these profile definitions to help people get a better track down as to what the stuff is. But yeah, I mean, even Hippo at the moment, it really doesn't have a lot of
No, but
stuff
it links
about
to
it.
a national specification. I think that's one of the key, is one of the things I was going to ask is if you click that link, I know it just says See Australian Digital Health Agency, but it goes to a PDF specification that describes the formation and use and so forth of the identifier.
Yeah, actually goes to a page that doesn't return anything at the moment. I've raised a help desk issue with it, telling them that their important document is not supplyable.
And we should probably update those links because I think it's been updated.
Absolutely, yes, indeed.
But I think the
But
same
then, yeah.
thing, similar to what Andy was suggesting, would be necessary for the new identifiers is to link to the material that has all like the policy and rules around like the real world of it.
Yes, indeed. Good point. So if this thing has enough information, then we can link to this and it can follow the same pattern. If this doesn't have enough information, then we'll have to see about what we can do to find from Services Australia enough information about their identifiers for people to know what they mean.
Yep.
Okay. So that's a useful thing to do that's useful input to improve this. So basically, yeah, this has got to help you, give you more understanding of what the identifier is, you know,
Mm.
or at least tell you where to go to and who to ask. Yeah.
Looking at the time, we need to talk, I think, about next steps for there's a proposal for AU-based to go to ballot in February. The next meeting is the last meeting to approve basically any new structures to make that deadline for the February ballot. So any of the actions that need to be undertaken, if this is intended to be included, would need to come for approval in the next FHIR Work Group meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can I also then put to the people in the call, besides, I think what's been talked about, which is handling invariant HAE3 separately, I think both Andy and I have concerns that it's probably not, there's not value in adding an extra processing component there. And if it is introduced, talking about the resource management partition. And I think we've also identified there needing to link to some sort of specification that talks about what happens with this identifier in the real world, um, not just the syntactic definition of it. My third item, which can be held over potentially to the next call or maybe done outside of this, is I think we need to look at how many identifiers we're distinguishing with the identifier type of NOI. I think that it's starting to become not useful, quite significantly not useful to have lots of different identifier types distinguished and having a national organization identifier as the type. And potentially this would trigger an AU core change as well that says anything with an NOI has to be an ABN or a HPIO. So if this was going to be looking to be exchanged with AU core, fixing these to NOI would mean that they cannot be exchanged in accordance with AU core.
Oh,
So I think there's something about the type that needs to be thought about.
yep. Yeah, I mean, one of the things is of the types, it is a national organization identifier. Yeah, what do we want to do with type going forward? Type from memory, identifier type from memory is meant to be a moderately broad classification, not a super exact thing of it. But it's open to us to decide we want to have a bunch of very specific identifier types.
There is an Australian code system that's set up to account for where we have wanted specific types. There are a number where we have specific ones.
Yeah.
I'm not immediately suggesting that we should have identifier types for these, but I wanted to raise that using NOI means that these can't be exchanged using AU core.
Oh, why? Sorry, again, why can't these be exchanged using
Because
IA
there's a
core?
rule in
Oh,
AU core that an
okay.
identifier of type NOI is either an ABN or it is a HPIO,
Oh, sorry,
I
I thought you
think.
were thinking that was a proposed thing, not an existing
No,
thing.
no, there's a
Okay.
rule actually in. I think
Yeah.
we've got rules in AU core
Hmm.
um, that look at identifier types
Hmm.
and make
Yeah.
some rules around. So look at the coded value and say, well, it can only be one of this or this. These are totally new, so they wouldn't fall into that set
Yeah.
of rules.
Yep. So
It's also, I think, the
either,
question on do we actually want to be this broad across 5 different identifier type profiles? For patient identifiers, for example, we've gone very specific. Like IHI is its own type. So it would depend on how this needs to get used as to whether or not the type NOI is actually useful,
yep.
or if it is too generic to help drive any kind of behavior using identifier type, which I know a lot of systems do use identifier type. Brett.
Um, in AU core, it's just sliced on system, right? So it shouldn't. Why would it be an issue?
AUCore has an invariant. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, there
Oh,
is an
okay.
invariant there. That's what I'm warning about. Yeah, that's the invariant.
Oh, what's that
It
then?
says
Anyway, I'll work with that. Yeah.
because NOI is also international, we put a restriction in Australia to say, or like there are other things that could be NOIs, heaps of them, and we put a data quality restriction in AU core, that org one, um, that says we recognize these 2 types of national organization identifiers, and that's it. So if you've got that type, it goes and checks it's one of these.
Yeah, that is problematic because
Yeah.
we use a lot of NADA identifiers, which is a nationally kind of consistent identifier set.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy to take that invariant out. I think that would be a good relaxation. Um, Sorry, not that identify that invariant out. I think it would be a good relaxation, but right now in AU Core R1 and what's going to be published in R2, because nobody's raised that JIRA, that's what this does.
Yeah. I'm glad
So
someone
yeah, I just
remembered
wanted to
that.
raise identifier type. I think there's some thought work there on how we want that to be used for organizations. Oh,
Yeah.
Brett?
Oh, just Andy. NADA's got its own um, identifier
Does it?
definitions.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's got its own code.
with a different type. Yeah.
We've only got two identifier profiles, oh no, three identifier profiles in AU base currently that use NOI. All the others that are national level and organization have their own specific code.
Yeah.
But if we introduce two more, that I think undermines probably what you want to use AU core organization for. So we're coming up to time. Um, I'm happy to also have a conversation outside of this coming in on what would the proposal would be across space and core to incorporate these. Does anyone else have any other items they just want to quickly flag for Richard before we look to close up the meeting? I'm not hearing any, but I assume, Richard, you're quite happy to be contacted to
Oh,
discuss these
yes.
new. Yep.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, please contact me with any comments or thoughts or questions. Um, yeah, the basic things we've got it is that the HA3 invariant, we don't need it, so we're not going to do that. It needs to have more information about what the meaning of these identifiers is and refer to appropriate documentation on that. And then there'll have to be an investigation about what we're going to do with identifier type. That NOI as currently set would break in AU core, well, it is incompatible with AU core constraints. And so the thing then becomes, what do we want to do with identifier type? One of the things about those very specific identifier types is there's a thing here in the R4 definition of the identifier data type saying that identifier type is meant to be a broad category, not to meant to be a highly specific thing. So I think that's part of the conversation we should have about identifier type. I'm not sure what we're going to do with landing that. So we've got a easily acceptable solution before next meeting.
I'm happy to discuss with you.
Yeah,
I think about 2.5 years ago when we were doing the NADA ones, we
yeah.
went through a cycle of thinking
Mhm.
about that, broad, narrow, etc.
Yep.
We ended up landing on narrow, which is why we have NADA
Yep.
specific codes. But we can relook at that on why that choice was made at the time, whether or not that's still appropriate. Brett?
Yeah, I just think a definition because at the moment, I mean, we have NOI on HPO, which is National Identifier for Healthcare Systems, and then we got PIO for non that aren't HPO. And so where does HSP live relative to that overlap, which I think Andy said before as well, because
Mm.
it's like, can you have a PAO and an HSP?
You can't have a hippo and one of them. I don't know about a PAIO and one of those.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. So I
we've
think
got
that
an explicit
clarification
thing
would be
saying
good.
that you're either a healthcare provider or you're one of these other guys. Um, but yes, look, it's a good question about further up the organisation. My guess is that Services Australia would say you're too big. You've got to choose two subparts and give an identifier to that one and a different identifier to that one.
Yeah, because it's more like if we knew that these specific identifiers made up the whole of in our scope, that would make sense, right? But if it was kind of like overlapping, I think it's kind of a bit difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Richard.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, in terms of our next meeting, I think we're going to continue the conversation on these identifiers. Looking hopefully to have some designs there. I think that's the target, right, Richard, to have some designs to approve.
Yep.
We will also look at publication approval for AU Core R2 and AU Patient Summary. Oh, no, actually not yet. I think it's AU Core R2 will be the publication approval coming to the next call. Are there any other items that people would like to put on the agenda for our next call? Not hearing any. You can email the co-chairs. You can ask for that in Zulip, or because we have the agenda page already up, you can put a comment on the agenda page if you'd like to add something to that. And I think I'll call the meeting to a close. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. I think I'll see you in a fortnight.
Bye.
See you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.